If you look above me is AMD Fluid Motion Frames. AMD's claim to fame feature, because Nvidia doesn't have this, Intel doesn't have this, but this feature, Fluid Motion Frames, is basically frame generation that can double your frame rate in pretty much any game out there. But it's not magic. I take out my gun. If you look at the crosshair in the center of the screen, you can see just moving the mouse here. If I go slowly enough, which is another weird quirk about this, that it is kind of like jittering and going everywhere. And that's because this feature is not integrated into the game itself. It's actually interpolating new frames, made up frames basically, on top of the game. It doesn't know what is a HUD element, what needs to stay static on the screen, and what doesn't. And there's also different things like with the image quality itself, because when I'm moving my mouse here, I'm seeing just this light pole in front of me is like all blocky and weird. The major downside to this feature, the FPS counter, when I'm moving the mouse very fast, completely drops. We're at like 80 FPS now. Completely turns off the frame generation, which pretty much makes it unusable, because when you are turning your mouse quickly, that's exactly when you want more frames. You want the motion that you're experiencing in the game to feel smoother. That's the whole upside about it. So yeah, this AFMF doesn't really work that well, or at least in the first iteration. And that's why AMD introduced AMD Fluid Motion Frames 2. The original one's been so basically unusable for so long, and I'm excited that this one is here. So we're at about 100 FPS before, and now we're at about 181. Let's just see. There's no motion blur on right now, by the way, guys. 100% feels smoother right now. When I move my mouse very quickly, it still does turn off, so it's not like they eliminated that problem. But I will say that it does take a little bit more for me to get that to trigger. I will say, just because you can turn your mouse more now, that automatically makes the game feel quite a bit smoother. Let's go ahead and throw this on and see if we could get, you know, from like, say like 40 FPS. Yeah, so you can see up in the top left, we're now getting 80 because we're going from 40, and we're going to doubling to 80. Yeah, I mean, this looks much better and feels, actually even the lag doesn't feel that bad. We're apparently getting 14 milliseconds of latency here, according to the frame generation lag. And I don't feel like that's that bad. And these are the things that it's claiming to do. For lower latency and higher performance, fast motion optimization, improved borderless full screen support. Like in games, like if you couldn't go exclusive full screen, then AMD AFMF doesn't really work in those games. Now it's supposed to work in OpenGL and Vulkan games, which is huge. And then also Radeon Chill interoperability support, and this is an FPS cap. You weren't able to use it with AFMF before, but now you can use it with AFMF to cap your frame rates through the driver. If we look at AFMF 1, you can see that all you can do is enable it or disable it. And it just tells you if it's active or not. And AFMF 2, they're adding two other options. I don't think that's why it's called 2. The first one is search mode. Search mode is improving the frame generation smoothness by improving how fallback works in AFMF 2. Fallback refers to when AFMF frame generation is temporarily disabled in high motion scenes. That's like when you move the mouse too fast, you know, it turns off. That's what we're talking about here. So it's supposed to make that better to ensure the best interpolated image quality, which can sometimes cause jitter and impact the smoothness of the gaming experience. It's been an experience with AFMF 1 that it just doesn't feel smooth. Like it shows on your screen it's 180 FPS or something, but it does not feel like 180 FPS, not even close. So hopefully with, you know, this search mode, it can improve it. And basically there's two options that you can do here. Well, one will be auto. We'll go over that in just a second, what the auto means. But then there's also standard and high. Basically the search mode versions are better at different resolutions. So if you're at 1080p, it's gonna do standard. That's gonna be the one that you wanna do. And then a high is for like 1440p, 4K, ultra wide, whatever other kind of resolution. Then the second thing is the performance mode. Actually matters a lot, because when you're using frame generation on your graphics card, it's not free frames necessarily. I mean, it uses some of your graphics card's resources to, you know, interpolate between those frames. And sometimes that can push your base frame rate and then your frame generation too. Sometimes it can push it too low. You need a way to make it less demanding on your graphics card. Basically, now what they're allowing you to do is, like if you're on a lower end system, they're adding a quality mode, which is obviously highest quality. I know it's kind of in the name. And then there's also performance mode. Should make things run a little bit smoother. And then the next thing that they're claiming here is just better latency overall, because obviously frame generation has latency associated with it. There's no way around it. You're holding back a frame to see what the frame goes in between, and it's gonna, versus the AFMF 1, it's 28% lower latency in Cyberpunk. We'll check that as we go. And then in Counter-Strike 2, I don't know why you'd use frame generation in Counter-Strike 2, but they're claiming it has 12% lower latency in this game. So it seems like it could vary quite a bit game to game how much lower latency it is, but we can check that, at least with some software tools. So that'll be good. If you have auto on your graphics card, basically if you're at 1080p, it's gonna pick the standard mode for that search mode in your game. So it's gonna be standard at 1080p. At 1440p and 4K, it's gonna pick the high setting for the search mode, okay? Knows what's in your system, so honestly, you could leave it on auto most of the time. You could switch it to them if you wanna make sure it's on that mode, but the other part of it matters on what kind of graphics card you have. So AMD Radeon RX 600, 6000, and 7000 series graphics cards, which is the only graphics cards that AFMF works on. These ones will get the auto for quality with their performance mode. And then if you're on a APU, so an integrated graphics card on your CPU, then you're gonna be on the performance mode to, you know, allow it to get a decent frame rate. So you're gonna get lower quality visuals on an APU or something. This is a pretty big update for AFMF 2. The problem is AFMF 2 has competition, and that is this lossless scaling. I made a video about this not really that long ago if you want to see a very in-depth video on it. Scaler that can do frame generation right here has only gotten better and better over time. Like, it just recently got an update that just improves how it looks in all games in any case. This is very similar to AFMF, where you can use this in any game that is DirectX. I'm pretty sure it's just like how AFMF was. But like, this just works. And then you can also do ×3 frame generation. So you could go from 60 to 180 FPS. Kind of wild, but we're just going to do the X2 mode. And I kind of think a lot of the stuff that AFMF 2 introduced, like, you know, the performance mode and everything, this had that first. Let's go ahead and turn on lossless scaling frame generation. I ain't gonna lie, guys, like, this feels a lot smoother than AFMF 2. Like, this feels like 120 FPS. Like, I turned this off. Oh man, it feels so choppy. It feels so freaking choppy. Instantly feels smoother. It feels so good, guys. And that's the thing about AFMF, and I'm not sure if it can really compete with this. Now let's jump in and analyze these in depth to see if AFMF 2 is actually better. And just to spoil a little bit, it's been the next day. That's why I'm in different clothes. I've done a lot of testing, and it is quite a bit better. So on the left side of the screen, you're seeing the native frame rate that the game could get. In this case, in Cyberpunk here, it was hitting about 106 FPS. I'm showing you guys all this footage at 1440p because I am able to actually capture 1440p through a capture card. So we're seeing everything as we would see it at 120 FPS. We can do 25% speed. That's 30 FPS. Now, in order to compare these, I'm showing you guys 60 FPS on the cap, and then that's being frame generated up to 120. And that's so that every other frame is completely generated by the frame generation. Because AFMF 2 has some massive improvements to AFMF 1. And the biggest thing is that fall back. You know, like if you move your mouse too quickly, then it starts to kind of turn off the frame generation because it wouldn't look good enough. It looks so much better on AFMF 2. And I think this is expertly shown to us in Overwatch 2. AFMF 1 on the left side and AFMF 2 on the right side. You can see that Overwatch 2 is a very high motion game. A lot of things are changing in the frames. It can turn off a lot with that fallback. And you can clearly see that on the left side, the FPS in the top left, on AFMF 1, kind of turns on and off at times. On the right side, you can see it's holding 120 FPS. That's going from 60 FPS to 120. It's clearly holding up so much better with the fallback. It's hard to understate just how important this is. There's gonna be motion in games unless you're like using frame generation on The Sims or something. That's exactly when you want frame generation to run. The thing is, I would show you guys more examples of this, but I used mostly just like really smooth benchmark passes to show this stuff off. They don't really make that come up nearly as much as the Overwatch example, but this is so practical in actual gameplay. These benchmarks are just too smooth to actually illustrate that for you guys. I also want to point out too, the latency is just greatly improved. If you see on the left side of the screen, when we're at 60 FPS with AFMF 1, we're getting an extra 26 to 27 milliseconds of latency compared to the right side on AFMF 2. We're getting 10 milliseconds of latency. So we're dropping 16 milliseconds of latency. Now, I'm not 100% sure how much we can trust this from AMD. I can't really measure this super accurately. To me, I don't feel a major difference between the two. That is a huge difference, and I'm kind of trusting their calculations on their little on-screen display thing. That's so important with frame generation. No matter what, it is going to be holding the next frame in the game to, make the frame in between it. As much as we can minimize that latency, the better. And as long as it doesn't impact the image quality too much. And speaking of the image quality with the AFMF 2, I think the tunnel here in the Cyberpunk benchmark is a really nice illustration of this. Quite a bit of image quality problems with AFMF 2. To me, the frame pacing, that is like the rate at which you see these generated frames, to me looks a little bit smoother on AFMF 2. And we can see more of this in Ratchet and Clank, just as things are kind of moving across when he's running on this red carpet way. It's just a little bit smoother on AFMF 2. I don't think this is any kind of earth-shattering difference. I don't think a lot of people are going to pick up on this unless you see them side by side, but it is a little bit better, and AMD didn't specifically say this in their changelogs, so it's a nice improvement, and I can definitely appreciate that. The next thing that's super nice is now you can use it with Radeon Chill. In Ratchet and Clank here, it is super nice to use Radeon Chill to cap the frame rate, because in my case, I'm capping at 60 FPS, frame generating up to 120 FPS. But a lot of people do want to cap their frame rates with frame generation because it gives a smoother experience. It lowers the latency by capping your frame rate. In Ratchet and Clank here, it doesn't have a frame rate limiter. It just has VSync in the game, and it is a limited version of VSync. It doesn't allow you to like customize the frame rate at all or anything like that. And if you can't use Radeon Chill within the AMD drivers, then you're pretty much stuck using something like Riva Tuner Statistics Server. And Riva Tuner Statistics Server apparently adds some sort of latency to the game. And I want to say too that Radeon Chill seems to give really smooth like frame delivery. You can see here on the frame time graphs in Ratchet and Clank, Riva Tuner Statistics Server, it was also very smooth, but it has that latency. But you can see that the frame time graph is super smooth on both sides. Really no problems whatsoever with Radeon Chill. But don't get too excited though, because AMD didn't claim that the image quality on AFMF 2 is really going to be any better than AFMF 1. And that's basically what I've found. I mean, they still have quite a few issues with this, especially in like Ratchet and Clank here. I think that's a nice obvious example. Say like Clank's mouth, you can kind of see there's some blocking that goes up and down on his mouth that doesn't really look smooth, but there might be some screen tearing going on here. That's definitely possible, but that isn't really a good sign for AFMF in general, because it should be working with adaptive sync with my capture card, but it isn't really working if the screen tearing is going on. You can also see as I'm kind of spinning around in Cyberpunk, I'm just literally spinning around in a circle. They look pretty similar. I really don't see major differences. There's like you can see major problems with the image qualities. It looks very juddered. Some of this I think is screen tearing, but isn't all of it. Like it just doesn't look smooth, and that is part of the problem with AFMF, and they didn't improve this from what I can tell, is it just doesn't feel like you are actually turning on frame generation. Like the number goes up in the stats, like it says you're getting double the FPS or whatever, but then when you actually play the game, you're like, this doesn't feel like the smoothness of double the FPS, and it doesn't really convince me that much that it's working. The frame pacing, that's part of what makes it feel smooth, is still a little jacked up. And this juddered movement can also be found in like Overwatch 2. Torb is the GOAT, but we see Kiriko behind this glass here. And especially as we turn around the occlusion with this, we even freeze frame it here. That's definitely not refraction or anything going on in the glass. That doesn't look right. She looks really jacked up in motion here, and it takes the freeze frame sometimes to really analyze that. You can even see with the outline of her character, the glass here looks really messed up, but then as it's going over the pole, kind of getting duplicated and it looks sharper, but it's definitely a very challenging scenario. Not working that great. The image quality isn't insane. I mean, I'm gonna give it obviously some slack because AFMF, I mean, it's frame generation that isn't integrated into the game. It has basically no game data whatsoever, and at least we're getting more frames. That's definitely something that's nice. You can also see a lot of things like with the HUD. You might question why I used Overwatch for this, because who the heck would use frame generation in Overwatch? But it has a lot of fast-paced movement, and it has a lot of HUD elements. It kind of falls apart in motion, especially on AFMF 2, now that it doesn't turn off when you move too quickly. This is just a dramatic example in Overwatch, but this comes up a lot in other games, just not as pronounced. So it's nice to see in a YouTube video like this. This isn't a blessing from God or something like that. This definitely struggles at times, and you can see it pretty easily when you're playing a game. I would recommend using it on a game without as many HUD elements, just because it just doesn't work as much, and without as much movement, because the image quality just doesn't always hold up all the time, especially with transparent objects, things occluding each other, all that kind of stuff. It can just struggle in a many scenarios. Now, I bet you're wondering, what about the new performance mode and quality mode that they introduced? All of these tests have been done on the quality mode with the high search mode. How do these compare, and how much are you losing by going to performance mode? They both look exactly the same to me. I'm spinning around in Cyberpunk here. I really cannot tell a difference between them. They look pretty much exactly the same. And in Overwatch, and they look about the same as well. I mean, tell me if you spot anything major. Some things could just be screen tearing or something like that. Generally, throughout these cutscenes or everything that I'm benchmarking here just doesn't really look that different between these. So I don't think you're really losing that much going to performance mode. Maybe it changes at different resolutions or based on the power available on your GPU. This is on the RX 7800 XT, which is a fast graphics card. Keep that in mind. This is capable of quite a bit. But in terms of the actual performance, the FPS that you're getting with this, AFMF 2 on performance mode versus quality mode, you're getting a little bit more performance, at least on the RX 7800 XT. I mean, it wasn't anything that significant. Like if we just line it up in Cyberpunk here, we got an average FPS of about 103 or 104 FPS. The quality mode, we got about 100 to 101 FPS on average. I mean, it's like a 4% difference between these. It's not that big of a deal. But if you're in a certain scenario where like your GPU just isn't fast enough, you know, you just can't get that little bit of performance that you need out of it, then it could matter. And it just really depends on your graphics card situation. That I really just can't tell you without doing an insane amount of testing. They also have the standard versus high search modes. And obviously, when you go up in resolution 1440p 4K, AMD recommends to use the high one. I only did these in Cyberpunk because it was just becoming way too much testing, but I can't really tell a major difference between these at all. I think the only quality difference I could pick out is that it seems like the standard version, at least at 1440p here, I'm not sure about like 1080p or at 4K, there's a little bit of chugginess that goes on with it. It's kind of hard to describe this, but like I see the bottles in the background kind of catching up a little bit as it's kind of panning across the screen here. It's pretty small. I don't think most people will be able to tell, at least the options available if you do have some issues with it. Now, in terms of performance, these perform exactly the same, margin of error. Although, and this is probably something a lot of you guys have been waiting for, is how does this compare to Lossless Scaling Frame Generation? Because this is just a $7 little tool that you can buy. These do a very similar thing. They don't integrate into the game. They just frame generate outside of it to make it look smoother to us. I've been very impressed with Lossless Scaling Frame Generation. It uses machine learning to get as good as it is, but we have to compare these two. And I think in almost every single way, Lossless Scaling Frame Generation looks much better than AFMF 2. Like, it is no competition. And what blows me away is that this is made mostly by a solo developer. This is shown so well in the Cyberpunk alley here on the benchmark. The walls and stuff as you go by just look like they're chugging along, and that they're not even really being frame generated. It's just kind of like it's picking pieces and then moving them to the next frame for the AFMF 2. It doesn't feel like you're getting 120 FPS. That feels smoother than 60 FPS, Whereas Lossless Scaling Frame Generation feels like you're playing at 120 FPS. It genuinely does. And it doesn't have that many artifacts in motion here. Like if we go back to that same scene in Overwatch, you can see that Lossless Scaling Frame Generation isn't perfect either, and it actually kind of tends to completely slur the image where she is. It's weird. It's almost like those AI alternate timeline memes or whatever. It almost feels like that, and it's funny because it is machine learning. Like it is kind of that alternate timeline here of where we see smoother frame rates instead. But we see that same type of thing where it kind of smooths out the area, but it looks smoother. The glass refraction just looks better on it. It looks more natural, even though it does bug out a little bit at times. And in here in Overwatch 2, we see other huge examples of the UI. The UI on Lossless Scaling Frame Generation isn't perfect either. It isn't integrated into the game, so it does some algorithms to try to detect where UI is in the game to try to not glitch it out all the time. AFMF 2 will literally duplicate and scatter around and garble the crosshair, or even the UI in the bottom left corner of the screen, especially with the transparency of like the fire and everything. AFMF 2 will garble that to hell. Lossless Scaling Frame Generation doesn't seem to do as bad. It will have some of its own issues, like it kind of slurs things around the UI. It doesn't just like make this blocky mess, but it'll drag things with it. Like if we see here in the little spin around example in Cyberpunk, pulls the background with the HUD element on the crosshair, which is really weird looking. But it does look better than garbling it or anything like that. I think it looks a lot more natural to me. And I think this is even usable in a first-person game where the HUD elements are moving quite a bit. And this spinning around example in Cyberpunk for AFMF 2 is just an awful showing for it. You can just see how everything seems to chug. That isn't really screen tearing, at least from what I can tell. It just looks like a mess. The thing is, you don't really see it while you're playing the game. It looks relatively smooth, but that's why the game doesn't look like 120 FPS. That's why Lossless Scaling Frame Generation looks smooth in comparison while you're playing the game, how you feel it. I know I'm showing you guys this slowed down and everything, but it genuinely reflects when you play the game. This is just to show you guys what's actually happening. AFMF did have an advantage before because it did work pretty well without capped frame rates in your game, but now Lossless Scaling Frame Generation is catching up to that, and it looks pretty decent. Although I'd still probably recommend capping your frame rate and trying to maintain that capped frame rate as much as possible. Something interesting about Lossless Scaling Frame Generation 2 is AFMF 2 only just added the ability to work with Radeon Chill. But obviously, this third-party software didn't have any conflictions with Radeon Chill, and you can use it with it. You can see in Ratchet & Clank here, it was already working fine with it. So I don't know why AMD couldn't do that from the start. The major problem with LSFG, really not the image quality. The image quality is great. I love it. It makes games look a lot smoother. The problem is the performance. This is mainly because LSFG uses machine learning. That costs quite a bit more for your GPU to handle. It uses some algorithms to make it work on literally any single GPU out there. I mean, I was trying this on an RX 5000 series GPU that's from 2018. It's still working just fine. This does take a toll on the system. And you can also see in Ratchet & Clank Rift, the doubled frame rate on AFMF 2 is so much higher because LSFG on quality mode, it seems less consistent. There is actually hope for you. LSFG has a performance mode on it, and LSFG THS, the guy who makes it, he integrated this feature way before AMD integrated the performance mode on AFMF. I kind of think that AMD might have copied him, but that's just a theory. And if you see here, it's actually really important that performance mode is getting us like 98 FPS on average in Cyberpunk compared to 100 FPS on AFMF 2. And that's really close. That's pretty much indistinguishable margin of error when it comes down to it. So nobody would really be able to tell. What's really interesting too is if you actually compare LSFG performance versus quality, that they don't actually look that different. Just here, there is obviously bugs with LSFG in general, but comparing these two, they have similar bugs to each other. Performance mode looks a little bit less stable, but the HUD elements, like the reticle in the middle, it looks generally speaking about the same on both of them. The only major flaw that I found with LSFG performance versus their default setting. When you're at lower frame rates, like 40 FPS, which I don't really recommend using frame generation at 40 FPS, the frame pacing doesn't seem as good on performance mode versus the quality mode. This isn't some huge difference. It still feels smoother than what it would be at native. That's probably one of the things that they compromise with the performance mode on this is the frame pacing. And its performance mode can go toe to toe with AFMF. So it starts to kind of make you wonder, why would you use AFMF 2 at this point in time? That isn't to say that AFMF 2 doesn't have huge improvements compared to AFMF 1. Like, it actually seems like at sometimes actually usable now. But now with AFMF 2, because you can turn your mouse and it doesn't destroy itself, things can move in the game and it doesn't destroy itself, it is pretty useful. And the latency improvements with it are definitely huge ups. I can't personally really feel the difference between it. I don't have them side by side to actually test. I think that's really cool. At least they made improvements to that. I'm also glad to see that there is other settings with it now, the search mode settings and the quality and performance settings. I mean, they might not always be useful all the time, but it's nice to freaking have them, okay? It gives you more options, it gives you more versatility based on your resolution, based on the graphics card. And it's also really nice that we can use Radeon Chill with it now, because Radeon Chill has less latency than Riva Tuner statistics server, and it allows us to cap frame rates in games that you can't always cap frame rates in. Not everybody uses it all the time, but Radeon Chill is generally speaking just a nice feature to have. However though, I mean, their image quality, there's a lot of blockiness going on here. AFMF 2 definitely, in terms of image quality, doesn't hold up to Lossless Scaling Frame Generation at all, and that's made by a solo developer for the most part. As well as the frame pacing, this is probably the biggest problem with AFMF, is the frame pacing. You don't even feel like you're doubling your frame rate. Big number go bigger, but does it really get better? You know, that like Lossless Scaling Frame Generation has proper frame pacing and it genuinely feels smooth. These issues with the AFMF that it's having are actually really similar issues that FSR3 Frame Generation had at the beginning. And I'm hoping that AMD can improve these things into the future. And also, if all that screen tearing is going on, I hope they can fix the screen tearing with AFMF. So I think to most people, convenient part about AFMF is it's built right into your driver. So if you can use it, then you might as well use it. Also, it's nice that it's in OpenGL and Vulkan. I heard that's really nice for emulators and that kind of stuff too. So Lossless Scaling Frame Generation, you do have to buy another thing for $7. I know $7, we're gonna go broke over this. You do have to have another program and you do have to set it up a little bit. It's really not hard to set up at all, but you do have to consider that a little bit, that a lot of people aren't gonna know about that. And at least AMD is providing something. I also just kind of wish AMD prioritized different things with this instead of prioritizing all of these smaller features that AMD kind of brought to the table here. I wish that they just improved the image quality and the frame pacing first to make it a very like usable feature, and then added on all of these little things after that, because I think that would be way more useful. We don't even know if the image quality or frame pacing is going to get better. Honestly, we have no guarantee. Apparently this is a second version of it now, and it is exactly the same as it was before. I wish AMD prioritized the image quality first above all the other things, because yeah, it can do the other things, but do you ever want to use it? Definitely room for improvement here, and I still don't know why AMD hasn't really been adopting machine learning for this upscaling and frame generation stuff. But that'd make AFMF pretty much the go-to answer. That'd make it a really, really good product. But that's about it though. I don't know exactly why you'd use AFMF 2 when you have Lossless Scaling Frame Generation available. If you do have that, it's only $7, guys. It really doesn't cost that much for how freaking good it is and how powerful it is. So if you want to see a very in-depth video about Lossless Scaling Frame Generation, I did make that. It should be on this side of me, okay? So just check that out. It's a really good video. At least I think it is. So enjoy that. I'm gonna see you guys in the next one. Y'all have a good one. Peace.